when you donate blood are hepatitis viruses, AIDS, AIDS virus. Hepatitis E certainly can be gotten from hogs, but hepatitis C can be obtained through human-to-human contact. So I don't think that breathing in hog dander would necessarily preclude you from donating blood.
Why is hydrogen sulfide toxic?
Okay, hydrogen sulfide is a really toxic gas. What it does, it binds the iron parts of enzymes that produce what we call ATP. ATP is the source of energy for cells, and our nervous system uses ATP exclusively. So ATP is produced in these small parts of cells called mitochondria, and if you block, you can block the production of ATP very efficiently with hydrogen sulfide, and that cell will die. So people who get acutely exposed to high levels of hydrogen sulfide can become immediately unconscious. And there can be even if they recover, there is generally permanent neurological damage that can show up many years later. But it's because of the fact that the hydrogen sulfide binds permanently to the iron moiety in these enzymes that use the iron atom or molecule to iron atom or iron ion to in the production of ATP. And it's a rather complex reaction, but that's the crux to it.
Can you explain to us how we're going to be exposed to the whole hydrogen sulfide from these vehicles? I'm not sure if people understand where that's coming from.
Yeah, the hydrogen. She asked where the hydrogen sulfide is coming from. It comes from the anaerobic fermentation of the stool and urine in the manure pool. Okay.
So
It's also produced in septic systems. There are many accounts of sewer workers being overcome by hydrogen, high levels of hydrogen sulfide in sewers and dying. Even their rescuers will die. And it's a gas that is produced in very high volume. And so when these hog barns are ventilated, they stink, but the stink is toxic. Okay, because that's the hydrogen sulfide. Even in small, it really hasn't been determined yet what a safe level one can be exposed to chronically over many years that is not going to harm you. There have been some preliminary studies out of USC which show that psychometric testing in people who live close to hog barns, they do more poorly on cognitive exams than people who live far away from hog barns and people who live in other cities, well away from hog barns. So chronic low-level exposure of individuals to hydrogen sulfide could have permanent neurological damage that is very slow in onset. Back there.
How are these hogs going to make this epidemic, flu epidemic worse?
They make it worse because, she asked, how do hogs make flu epidemics worse? Well, two ways. One is they act as a reservoir for flu viruses. They also act as because they can get co-infected with human and avian flu viruses. See, human and avian flu viruses are very similar. But the reason we don't get, say, a virus from a starling or a pheasant is because we don't have the receptors in our respiratory tree to actually have the virus stick to our cells and start producing virus. Hogs have two types of receptors. They have receptors for human viruses and they have receptors for avian viruses. And because there's tens of millions of them and thousands of them confined in one area, they can be co-infected with the same virus. And many times the H3N2 virus is asymptomatic in most hogs. So you can have a herd infected with H3N2 and not know it, because none of the pigs were showing any symptoms. But because the pig is also co-infected with H1N1, you can wind up with these variant hybrid viruses. the same cell has both viruses in it and are producing a hybrid virus that then infects the cattle worker or the person chewing the pig at a pig fair.
We know that there's an escalating problem with antibiotic resistance.
Yes.
When you get this many animals together, does that require greater use of antibiotics, which contributes to that growing problem?
Yeah, theoretically, the confinement of animals in closed spaces under stress increases the risk of disease and certainly increases the probability of transmission from one animal to the next. And so antibiotics have been used in the past. I think there's some regulation on this now. But in the past, they've actually just put antibiotics prophylactically in the animal's feed, because some studies show that the meat yield on antibiotic-fed animals was slightly higher than the ones that weren't getting it. So that chronic exposure, you see, bacteria are very adaptable, and they have small bits of DNA that are not part of their genes, but they transmit them from one bug to the next, that harbor antibiotic-resistant enzymes that break down the antibiotics. You see, in nature, there's a big battle between fungus and antibiotics. It's no accident that the first antibiotic, penicillin, came from a fungus, because fungi produce poisons that kill bacteria and give them an immediate advantage selectively where they're growing. So and bacteria have evolved ways of fighting that. So all of this is just sort of the natural course of evolution between viruses and bacteria, just put on steroids and happening in a hog calf. I mean, you see, I have a lot of patients with catheters, right? You can generate highly resistant strains of E. coli in patients with, say, Foley catheters that are constantly getting antibiotics for other reasons, or maybe even being given antibiotics. What happens is the antibiotic selects for the bacteria that are resistant to it. We've seen patients who cannot be treated with an oral antibiotic because all the oral antibiotics they were resistant to. That's not unusual. And it's a big problem in medicine, actually, because the problem is we're not making new antibiotics, so we're can run out of them. Okay.
What strains of flu are going around so far this year?
Well, I don't know about this year. H3N2 is one of them. Last year was H3N2 and a couple of other lesser viruses, but H3N2 was the major one. Anybody else?
Dr. Forney,
Yes.
how are you?
Good.
Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Several years ago, the chicken winner by Flandreau was put on top of the snow, and it shut down the Sioux Falls water supply, not once, but twice, 2 different years. I don't know if you remember that. That was just one instance. My concerns, like these flu vaccines, why cannot they keep up with the varying strains of the hog flu and the bird flus? And then the second question is, why can CAFO workers who did not bathe or change their clothes and stuff after working in the CAFOs and out in the public, can they spread that? Or if they're sick with it, can humans spread it from to humans from the animals? And then if you could explain the aerobic versus anaerobic manure. When we were on the farm and we spread the straw and everything, we didn't seem to have these problems. It was more of a dry form exposed to the sunlight. And now we've concentrated it into the liquid form, the anaerobic form. And is that what we're seeing here is because of that anaerobic lack of oxygen issue that the bugs aren't getting killed off?
Yeah, you see, with aerobic fermentation, or aerobic, it's basically oxidation, you have the production of CO2 and water. Okay, in anaerobic fermentation, the sulfur ion acts like oxygen and forms H2S, and that's hydrogen sulfide, as the final electron acceptor. And so the sulfur is the oxidant in anaerobic conditions, and oxygen is the oxidant in aerobic conditions. Now, with regards to why we haven't been able to keep up with flu virus is because because of the co-infection of viruses in the same animal, and the number of permutations is almost infinite. It's not only the recombination of the viruses, it's not only the recombination between two viruses, but also each virus has parts of its genome or parts of its DNA that are highly mutable. In other words, they change. And so it's, that's how these viruses escape immunity, is they change color, just like a chameleon. What was your first part of the question? About Sioux Falls and the chicken?
Yeah, the aerobic, there's like meningitis B, and then from hog waste, flu vac, the workers that work
Yeah.
in them, they don't, a lot of them require them to change their clothes and take a shower in and out.
Right.
We had a guy come to a meeting, he just reeked, his shoes were dirty, everything one day, and nobody could, I had to get up and leave, but some places they don't require that.
Yeah.
And can they be a possible
Oh, absolutely.
spreader?
No question about it.
Right.
In fact, a cattle worker can get infected by a novel virus being produced in that particular barn, and he won't be symptomatic for a week or 10 days, but still infectious during that period of time. So he's spreading it before anybody knows he's infected. That's the one real big problem with flu viruses, is that there's a period of time before symptoms actually start that the person is infectious. So you never know who you might get it from. Anybody else? What I wanted to emphasize really is that the hog barns act just like wildlife does, as a reservoir for viruses, and because hogs can be infected with different types of viruses at the same time, they produce novel viruses. It's a very efficient way of producing novel viruses. The H3N2 virus was first detected in 1998 in hog barns, and it became a major epidemic within 20 years. That can happen with any set of flu viruses. Thank you, Fred. Anybody else?
I recently read
I'm sorry?
I recently read a study of Duke University that was recently released that said that children that live within 1 to 3 miles from a depot have an increased risk of asthma. Can you explain how this might happen?
Yeah, it wasn't only Duke, but it was also University of Iowa. And the study that I read was of a school that was within 600 yards of a hog barn, and they clearly showed that there were days when the kids really couldn't go out to play because the smell was so bad. Now, it happens, it causes asthma because of the dander in the dander and the ammonia in the air, which is very irritating to the bronchial passages in your lungs, and that causes spasm and asthma. So it's the stink that's toxic.
Why is it more susceptible in children? Is it because their passages are narrower already, they're smaller, or they just get exposed to it earlier, their own immune system isn't built up yet?
Probably all of the above, actually.
Okay.
And children these days seem to have more allergies, and allergic asthma is a significant problem with a lot of kids. And they get exposed to these irritants, it makes it even worse.
Is the elderly population just as susceptible to that as children, would you say?
I'm glad you asked that. Actually, this last flu epidemic, the majority of deaths were elderly people, and the hardest hit were the baby boomers.
Will you be available to and ask some questions after your presentation?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.